All right, welcome to the first online lecture for the new year for Connerland, Howo, and Wab. All right, guys, if you notice, there's a couple things pretty different on this. Number one, you can see this face on this lecture along with hearing the voice. That can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your perspective, but we're going to give it a shot with this. Another thing that's going to be different this time around, I'm not going to do complete lectures. I'm going to do these things as quickly as possible. As a matter of fact, I'm titling this series whatever topic we're talking about, in this case the Renaissance, in less time than it takes for me to get to work. So I'm going to do these things in about 10 to 12 minutes at the most, except for this one with a little explanation on it. But here's the thing, you're not going to get any in-depth study on this. You're going to get the major points or the major topics that you need to know when it comes to test prep. So this is kind of a starting point. It's not in-depth study, we'll handle that in class, but it gives you an idea of where you need to focus your studies when it comes time. So as we go through all these topics, there's going to be a couple of basic characteristics I'm going to focus on in each. The first thing is going to be, what are we talking about and why did it happen? Second is going to be, what were the events or the major people involved in it? And third, what happened because of it? And that's probably the most important in this class, is what happened because of the topic we're talking about, in this case, the Renaissance. So, starting off with the basic features of what was the Renaissance. Well, basically, first thing we got to look at is, what does Renaissance mean? And what it means is it's a rebirth, and in the case of this, of art and learning that happened in Europe between the years of 1300 and 1650. It was a rediscovery of culture. It was a rediscovery of art that had been passed down from Greece and Rome. And it took a little while. As a matter of fact, it took just about the entire Middle Ages for conditions to present themselves in the right way where this stuff can be rediscovered again. So, looking at it a little bit more specifically here, why did the Renaissance not only start, but why did it start in Europe? And it's pretty simple, man. A lot of these works that had been lost, particularly, and I say lost, I mean more forgotten when I'm talking about that. To be honest with you, in the Middle Ages, people had other stuff on their mind. They didn't have time to paint. They didn't have time to sculpt. And if they did, it was more or less going to be in the glory or for the service of the church. So nobody really had spare time to be knocking out paintings, or more specifically, be able to do it full time. So as they rediscovered these quote-unquote lost works, they began to expand on it. And the reason it happened in Europe is because a lot of artists were fleeing from the advancement of a group called the Ottoman Empire that we'll look at later. So as that happens, and as the conditions increase, as the conditions become better in Europe because of the weakening of feudalism that occurs out of the Black Death, you kind of see this perfect storm of characteristics that allow this thing to rise up and really get. So although the Renaissance eventually ends up spreading to all corners of Europe as it expands over time, it begins in Italy for a couple of reasons. The first and foremost reason that this happens is because of the availability, or the prevalence of wealthy trading cities in Italy. And I'm talking about places that you need to be familiar with, like Venice, Pisa, and Genoa. And these were about the only places in Europe at this time that had, I guess you could say, the disposable income to support an artistic community. In other words, it was very hard in other parts of Europe for people to make a living from being an artist or a sculptor or a scientist or whatever it is. Second reason this thing gets going in Italy is simply because of its location. If you look at this map, you can see Italy is, number one, very close to where the Greek civilization and antiquity was, and number two is the exact location where the Roman Empire began. So they had a readily available location that was good to be able to rediscover these works and expand on them whenever it got going. So one of the main things to look at is, how was Renaissance art different from the art of the Middle Ages? And if you look at these two pictures, it's pretty striking and it's pretty apparent how they're different. Number one, Renaissance painting was obviously a little bit more detailed, or looks a little bit more, I guess you could call it, sophisticated. I mean, if you look at the painting, the one on the left, which is the Renaissance painting, has more depth to it. It has perspective. It's more realistic looking than the one on the right, which is representative of a medieval art style. Number two, Renaissance art was more secular, which meant that it dealt with everyday issues. It dealt with things in real life rather than issues pertaining to church, the Bible, the afterlife, whatever it was, which was the main focus of medieval art. All right, so moving forward and looking at some of the major figures or major players in the Renaissance, and first and foremost in most people's minds is Leonardo da Vinci. Now, I'm not going to go too in depth in the works or anything, because for the time purposes and things like that, and also because we're going to look at these pieces of art in class. But Leonardo da Vinci was the epitome of what's called a Renaissance man, which means he was good at everything. Okay, he was a scientist. He was dealt with anatomy. He was a chemist. Obviously, an artist, a sculptor, an inventor, and all these things that kind of encompassed all of the things that were considered to be important in a man of the Renaissance. In other words, you need to be well-rounded. You need to have some kind of education or some kind of training in all aspects of learning, science, art, whatever it is. Next on our list is Michelangelo, best known as the artist in charge or responsible for the artwork in the Sistine Chapel, which we'll look at a little bit more in-depthly in class. Now, not only were artists very important to the Renaissance, but scientists and writers were as well. And just kind of hit the main point here, the main one when it comes to science, we'll look at Galileo for a second. Now, Galileo is known as many things. He's known as the father of physics, the father of modern science, the father of astronomy, etc. The thing that he's best known for, and probably the most controversial aspect of his career, is what's known as heliocentric theory. And basically what this said is that the sun, or that the earth revolved around the sun, okay? Up until this point, most people believed, and specifically the church, believed that the earth was the center of the universe. And when Galileo comes out and makes this claim that the earth is not, in fact, the center of the universe, and the sun is, and we revolve around it, it causes a huge amount of controversy that ends up with him leading a good portion of his late life under house arrest because of the things that he came out being. Next on our list is a writer known as Machiavelli, whose best known work is called The Prince. And it's pretty influential work for the time in the fact that it dealt with two things. It dealt with how to get power, and I'm talking about from a political standpoint, which I guess it could translate into other forms of power, but mainly political in this case. It talks about how to get it and how to keep it. And basically what he says is you do what you got to do to get power. All right, if it works, it's okay. So he basically gave a lot of people on down the line justification to perform the actions that they did to not only get into power, but also mistreat people and do other things to keep their power. So bottom line on it, anything goes as long as it works. All right, wrapping up our hit list of major figures of the Renaissance. Last but certainly not least, and even though he comes towards the end of the Renaissance, he's still grouped up with these guys, is Shakespeare. Look, considered by many to be one of the greatest writers in history, still incredibly influential today. His works are still studied in schools. His works are still adapted into modern day movies and things like that. So you can't underestimate, you can't lessen the impact that he has had on writers and on people in general going forward. You can see on the slide a couple of the adaptations of his works today or in modern times. A movie came out a few years ago with Heath Ledger and Julia Stiles called 10 Things I Hate About You, which was an adaptation of the Shakespearean play Taming of the Shrew. Another one, and one of the best known probably, is Leonardo DiCaprio Romeo and Juliet that came out several years ago, in which they took the exact words from the play Romeo and Juliet and inserted them in a modern day setting in Venice, California, where instead of the two families being pitted, it was two rival gangs. So his legacy still goes on, and it'll still go on through time because of the things he's left behind. All right, guys, so wrapping up this very, very short, very, very, very quick list of major things about the Renaissance, the last thing we're going to look at is the legacy of it, or what was important because of it. What did it do? What changed? And the first thing that happened was a continuation of culture that had been lost through the period of the Middle Ages. So a lot of things that we deal with going forward in this class were directly responsible or directly tied to the things that happened in the Renaissance. When we talk about exploration, that is because of the ideals and the things that came about with the Renaissance. One of the things being, and I didn't mention it, was the spirit of adventure that comes out of it as well. So honestly, without the Renaissance, there's probably no exploration at this point that we're talking about. I'm talking about Columbus and Da Gama and all these other guys. Also humanism, which goes back to the secularism I talked about with the paintings. All humanism means, and you're going to hear me say this a lot in class, is just an emphasis on human potential and achievement. In other words, you're shifting the focus of artwork and of culture from religion and the church over to people in everyday lives and what can be accomplished through things that you do on earth. All right, so this wraps up the short trip through the Renaissance. Apologize for the editing and some of the things in this. This is the first shot on it. They will get better, but I appreciate you listening. I appreciate your work. If you're not a part of this class, if you're not from Union City, then I would appreciate you going to my website, www.connorland.weebly.com, and checking it out. You can get additional materials, documents, etc. there. And also, if you don't mind, subscribe to the channel. It's always nice to see new faces on it. So that wraps up this, and we'll see you on down the road.